Conversations, Part 2, the What Happened conversation. The What Happened conversation is identified by the authors as one common difficult conversation that we encounter. And if we think about how we approach this conversation, that kind of helps predict why this is difficult. The first problem, again, as the authors identify, is that we typically start with the premise that I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm here to tell you so, and maybe to be annoyed about it, but certainly to inform you that I am right and you are wrong. Many difficult conversations aren't really about factually what happened, but the interpretation of those facts. However, as we talked about with Myers-Briggs, what we see differs from person to person. And if you've seen the video where you're supposed to count how many people wearing a white t-shirt can bounce the ball and you've ignored something much bigger, you can see that our perception, it differs amongst us. Not only our perception differs, but the value we put on that perception differs. So starting from the position I'm right, you're wrong, assumes that everyone sees the same thing and everyone has the same value put on that perception, and that simply is incorrect. The second problem with the what happened conversation is we assume that we know what other people intended. We assume that if somebody, for example, walked by and didn't say hello to us, that they intended to snub us. Well, you don't know that. You don't know that they didn't have their glasses on. You don't know that they weren't upset about something else. You don't know that. Intentions aren't visible. But we do create stories to explain other people's behavior. Again, remember the story model of how we try to create meaning. We look at events and try to string them together with a narrative so we can explain their behavior to us, or we can explain all the circumstances to ourselves. But realize that intentions can be mixed. People can have both hostile and friendly intentions at the same time. They might be totally unrelated to you, or they might simply be irrelevant. Also, remember that intentions, even when they're good, they might still be hurtful. And you've probably experienced this, haven't you? Where someone's behavior hurt you and they said, well, but I meant, well, yeah. So intentions don't necessarily solve all problems. The third problem with the what happened conversation is that we focus on blame. We have, in the same way that we need to prove that we're right and someone else is wrong, we need for whatever awkward or uncomfortable or unfortunate thing to happen, we need for that to be someone else's fault. And this focus on people distracts us from focusing on the problem. And we've seen this as we read Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes, that when you keep focusing on the people, the problem tends to escalate and you are less likely to resolve it with a satisfying negotiation. Remember their mantra of be hard on the problem, be soft on the person. When you're hard on the person, people naturally get defensive and you can end up in some really unproductive spiral. So don't focus on the people if you're trying to negotiate, focus on the problem. How can we solve a problem? One thing to do is to stop arguing. And so the authors of the text are encouraging us to move from certainty to curiosity. When we argue, that inhibits us from discovering the other side's story. Instead, we just trade conclusions. Arguing is often unpersuasive. People rarely change their mind unless they think the other person has understood them. And if you're starting with blame and fault, it's unlikely that someone else is going to feel understood. If instead we start from a position of curiosity, pretend you're an investigator, find out what was going on, find out what this person did, find out what this other person intended, you're going to have a much more constructive start to the discussion. So uncovering our stories lets us see that we don't have all the information. Remember the behaviorist Daniel Kahneman saying, with the "what you see is all there is" observation. You don't see everything, and your certainty, your bias that you do, inhibits you from opening up to the idea that you don't know all the relevant information. As mentioned before, we see different things. Myers-Briggs points that out to us. Depending on whether we're an introvert or an extrovert, we actually perceive different things depending on our focus. Our different life experiences lead us to different conclusions. I'll never forget, I was once teaching a business law class, and I remarked that I had never had a conversation with a policeman where the policeman wasn't trying to help me. My experience with police was police simply try to help. I remember one student who was from a different ethnicity than I almost fell off his chair because that clearly had not been his life experience. So notice how my life experience is going to color how I view events the same way that his will. Not everyone has had your life experience, and that will affect how they see things. Also, we each have sort of different life rules that we apply to events, and those are going to change how our observations and their impact. In addition, we put different values on what we observe. Recall from Myers-Briggs that feelings people, that third dimension of the Myers-Briggs profile, are going to put a very different value on things than the thinkers. The feelings people are going to be concerned with the effect of events on people, and the T's are going to be concerned with having a logical result. Those are two good values, but they're different. And finally, we often have a bias that blinds us to our self-interest. Our view of things is colored by self-interest, and if you don't see that, you fall prey to a really overwhelming bias. So at this point, the authors suggest a shift from what happened to learning. Get out of the message delivery mode, in which you're saying, this is your fault, this is what happened, this is why you're wrong. Get out of that idea to being more the investigator. Find out what happened. Move away from the truth assumption, and rather than convincing other people that you're right, focus on understanding their perceptions. Find out what options they may have. Understand how complex the problems may be. This does a few things. For one thing, remember that you're likely to get a good result if other people feel they were understood. Even if you don't agree with their interpretation or their conduct, they will have the perception that you've been fair and that you've made an attempt at least to understand them. And in fact, they may feel very understood by the fact that you have made this inquiry. Realize that trying to understand someone doesn't mean you agree with them. You can tell someone, okay, from what you're telling me, I understand that you thought that the project was due on the 14th, and you thought this because of the email that went out earlier. Again, this doesn't mean that you agree with their interpretation. It means that you're reflecting what they're saying in a way that demonstrates to them that you're understanding what their perspective was. Focus on the interpretations, focus on the values. So you can focus now on, so you were interpreting that email as extending the deadline to the 14th. Am I understanding this the way you did? It also helps you focus on values. It sounds like in writing this person's personnel review that you were focused on cataloging all of the problems so that we had a good guideline on where to go next in terms of developing this person within the company. You can talk about the value of documenting shortcomings. And then you can say another value to a human resources review is recognizing what that person has done well so that they know that they're being supported. Again, this isn't an attack. It's simply saying how you complete that very common activity in businesses of doing a human resources review. It will sound different depending on what your values are. And when you point out what someone's values are, it doesn't mean that they can't also open up and see that there are other things that may be valued in that report. It's not an accusation. It invites others to help us solve problems when we start from a point of view of learning, of exploring values, of looking at perception. All of these helps people buy in to whatever solution arises. Another problem with the message delivery stance is that we think there's only one story. Embrace the idea that there may be more than one story about what happened. And so you can say something like, I know that you thought that the project was due the 14th, but I had earlier told you that the deadline was the 12th. Instead, move to an and story. It's possible both things were true, right? I understand that you don't want to break up, and I recognize that, and I need to because I want to go in a different direction in my life. So you're not shutting someone down, you're recognizing them. Both of those things can be true. Your boyfriend may not want to break up with you, and you still want to break up. Both of those stories are true. Understanding someone else's story doesn't mean that you agree with it or that you abandon your own story. It recognizes that there is more than one story. It allows you to be curious. It allows you to be clear. You gain in credibility because someone knows that you're hearing them, and you gain in buy-in. They understand that you hear them, and they're more likely to be on board with whatever solution you may come up with. And by you, I mean the plural you, not you singular. Now, intentions. If you recall from Kohlberg's stages of moral development, stage 3 was the rationalization that whatever I did was okay because I meant well. It's kind of a childish view of an ethical result. Meaning well doesn't mean that you had good intent, that the outcome was either moral or good. Intentions are limited. We assume that if we're hurt, the other person had bad intentions to us. We're all kind of self-centered about this. We assume that somebody intended whatever the result was to us. And this tends to foster alienation and suspicion. And if you've ever been involved in some huge gossipy thing, the more someone distrusts another, the more they put all kinds of kind of odd attributions to someone else's behavior. And again, we're self-centered. We assume our opinion is often based only on the impact of someone else's conduct on us. And there's a fair amount of data saying that with ourselves, we are much kinder. If we hurt others, we claim we had good intentions, and that the consequences of our behavior, as in Kohlberg's stage 3, is sanitized. We didn't mean harm, it's okay. So our defense is, well, I didn't mean to hurt you, stops us from hearing what their story is. And focusing on intentions stops us from exploring a more reasonable solution or future. So realize that there's two parts to this. We are often self-centered, so whenever something bad happens to us, we assume the other party intended ill. But when it's us, we assume that if we did something that harmed someone else, our intentions were good. We have a bias in favor of ourselves. So the solution is to separate the impact of the problem from the intention. Verify what you actually know, not the gossip, not the assumptions you're making, just factually, what do you truly know about what this other person did? Next, identify the impact on you. So when you didn't have the report ready on the 14th, this meant that we weren't able to get the project to the client. Identify your assumption about what the other person intended. So say something like, I'm assuming that you didn't read my message about the deadline, or you thought that someone else's message about the deadline was the one you should be paying attention to. In other words, ask, is that the correct assumption? And hold it as a hypothesis. In other words, this would be one explanation, but I don't yet know that that is true. So I'm asking you, is that what you were thinking? And again, try to make it sound less accusatory than frankly I am right now as I ask it. This helps you remain open to new information. It gives you credibility, because later, if it turns out your assumption was wrong, you were never accusing anybody of anything. You were simply trying to find out. So if somebody says, yes, I assumed that when the regional vice president told me that the deadline had been pushed, that's what that was true. And the authors tell us, don't pretend you don't have a hypothesis. Again, this is part of the story model of making sense of events. Start with my hypothesis. I'm assuming this. Let me know what was going on. Tell the other person about the impact on you, and you can consider asking about their intentions. It may or may not be worthwhile to ask about their intentions, but it's certainly fine to explain the impact on you. I'm saying that you may consider, but certainly don't need to ask about intentions, because I think it's often a diversionary tactic where people go on and on with sort of fruitless circular discussions about intentions that don't really solve problems. Oftentimes as well, there may be some underlying hostility, and focusing on intent isn't going to uncover some more healthier way to deal with a person. It's hard to avoid blame because that's our default, but try. Compare blame and contribution. Blame is a judgment. It looks to the past. It doesn't solve problems. And it tends to alienate the other party, and it tends to get all the parties more entrenched in their stories so that they can't more easily move to something more productive. By contrast, contribution looks forward. It helps us avoid getting locked into these positions and encourages us to share information. It encourages us to solve problems. You also sound way more mature and way more like a leader if instead of saying, but it was his fault, he told me the deadline was the 14th, I don't think this is my fault, I think this is his fault. You sound like a kid. You think you're going to get promoted sounding this way? Start sounding like an adult. Identify the problem, not the person, and work from there. There was a misunderstanding about the deadline. We can look to the past just so we can solve how that misunderstanding occurred. But then what happened already happened. So going forward, what can we do in the future to avoid repetition of that error? Then you start talking not about blame, this was your fault, but contribution. Okay, so going forward, how should we avoid this? Who sets the deadlines? Should someone be sending out a reminder maybe 48 hours ahead of time? Should we be checking in with each other more often? Just whatever solutions you can come up with so that you don't avoid in the future. You don't have the same problem in the future. Also, the whole book's about difficult conversations. This helps you solve some of the difficulty part of the conversation because it's easier to talk about. It's hard to talk about blame because you know you're going to be drawing lines and maybe alienating people, especially people who may be important to you. Talking contribution makes you look like a problem solver. It's not as scary a conversation.